Folks, good afternoon. I'm glad you can be here with us. I can see a few very familiar faces and some new faces as well, so welcome. Glad to have you here. We're really excited to spend some time with you today to talk about what we see as the keys to success when digitally transforming internal operations processes, sharing 5 key customer stories that we've worked on. I'm Neil Simpson, founder and principal of Innovelocity, and here with me are senior consultants David Zankowski and Ray Pineda. And as a company, we've been in the BPM and BPA space for over 11 years, working with clients in a variety of different industries with a long track record of success with different projects under our belt. And what we've found in common with almost all the projects that we're working on is that our customers are not coming to us asking for a particular digital transformation or BPM technology, but rather there are business divisions looking for solutions to some specific operational business challenges. Now, just a quick check, a show of hands. How many folks here in the audience today are from a business unit as opposed to an IT group? Pretty large proportion, actually. And that's generally our experience when we're working with people with Bizagi as well. So some of these I think you'll find very familiar, but most customers, when they come to us with some challenges, they typically fall into one or more of 4 key categories. The first one is effective utilization of resources, effectively getting more out of the people that you already have. And we're going to talk about a customer story where there was a 45% productivity improvement working with us and working with Bizagi technology, a really, really strong improvement in their operations. Another very common reason that folks work with us and work with these kind of technologies is to create improvements aligned to customer expectations. And that's typically measured as improved customer satisfaction scores or customer retention. And again, we have a great story to share about a customer that worked with us to really overhaul how that is. Speed of execution, also extremely common reason why people come and work with us on these types of projects. And we have another great case study where a customer took their cycle time from 3 weeks down to 3 days. And then last but not least, there's compliance. A surprisingly large number of customers come to us with compliance problems, either trying to resolve audit issues and findings which are already open, or being proactive and trying to make sure they have the infrastructure in place to prevent them from coming up in future, whether that be government regulations or customer audits. And on top of all of this, there's the ever-present need to move faster and be more responsive, whether it's changing customer demands, the potential to be disrupted by these born digital competitors that are using these tools right from the start, and an evolving regulatory requirement. And again, through the case studies that we're going to discuss, you'll see some examples about how customers were able to go live in a very short period of time, in around about 90 days. They're able to continue automating processes at a very rapid rate, at average about 1 per month, all the while having a very frequent and fast release cycle and continually tightening their SLAs and improving service to their customers. And the reason you're all here is because Bizagi does promise all of these benefits and more: higher levels of customer service, improved cycle time, reduction in operational costs, and more. However, Bizagi commissioned a study with Gartner back in 2015 that found that approximately 70% of these types of projects fail to realize their benefits. That could be either nothing actually gets released at all and no project is realized, or the project goes live, it's in use, but it's failing to deliver the expected benefits, those key indicators that we talked about earlier on. This hasn't been our experience, so what lessons have we learned from the 5 examples that we're about to share with you today? One thing I'll say that's common across all of these is that project failure or success is not really so much to do with the particular digital tool or technology that you select. The most important factors tend to be how the organizational transformation is planned and executed, all of the change management, the people, and the processes that go around it. So the first story I'd like to share is from a chain of specialty health clinics who rehabilitate people who have had some serious brain injuries. And right from the outset, the executives framed the goal of this program very clearly with an engaging and transformative vision for everyone to rally behind. And that was that the process to refer patients into these clinics for treatment was taking far too long. And this was putting the patient's recovery, health, and well-being at risk. It was very, very useful to get everyone aligned on what the purpose of the project was, but also it set a very clear indicator that could be measured, which was throughput time. And that guided everything that followed in terms of the design of the process, making trade-offs and decisions about how the process should work by having that very, very clear laser focus on that measurement. Another thing that I'll mention is that this particular customer started with an extremely significant process right out of the gate. I know many of you, when you're considering digital technologies like Bizagi and you're dipping your toe in the water, you might like to test it out on something that's relatively insignificant, low harm, low risk, just to make sure it works before you start rolling it out. However, this particular customer started with something which is really core to all of their revenue and is core to their business model. But what they did is, rather than building in all the complexity at the start, they created a very simple version of the process and put it into production quickly, started to realize some of the big benefits, and then added more complexity and more features on top of that. And the results have been outstanding because they were able to start realizing value within 90 days of initiating the project, and they were the ones that cut that throughput time from 2 to 3 weeks to 2 to 3 days.
Yeah, Neil, and another example to your third bullet is that a semiconductor materials manufacturer, where one of the first workflows that they automated was for their label request process. And I can tell you, as a former quality engineer at one of this company's customers, labels are a constant source of quality issues. Whether it's poor readability or incorrect content. And so they decided to say, hey, this is one of our biggest issues on the Pareto chart. Let's go solve it by automating it. And, and it helped address a lot of this company's issues, right? Because it can cause huge disruptions to a high volume manufacturing environment, whether you're returning lots of material to them, or in the worst case, right, they're bringing people on site to do sorting because they can't afford to disrupt the line. So
that's a great example, Ray. It's a very good one because it's another example of a very critical process that a customer started with, which had a big impact on their operational bottom line, and it served as a launching pad to grow within the entire organization. And that will actually be our next example we'll get on to here in a second. But one thing I'll say, again, the lesson from this particular customer that I would like to draw out is when you're selecting your projects, and when you're defining the measurements and indicators for how successful those projects are, you should really try and align them to the core strategy of your company, something that's going to engage and rally the troops and get people excited. Now, the second example is from the leading semiconductor manufacturer that Ray was discussing earlier on. They're a quite niche materials manufacturer, but they do some very specialty materials. And they were interested in moving into a rapidly growing segment of life sciences materials, a whole new line of business for them. And they needed to streamline and automate all of their processes across the whole enterprise to enable this rapid growth without having to add a ton of extra resources into their company. So it was a huge transformation program that they embarked upon. And it would not have been possible if there wasn't strong support from the CEO on down to say that this is a priority and that people have to participate. Because again, remember, this is a small company. They're being stretched very thin. They're running at 1,000 miles a minute trying to meet all these new customer demands, and they're working to design BPM processes. So that leadership was important to get the people in the room and make sure they were there. But above and beyond that, it was also incredibly important for leadership to nominate a single owner for each process that was being automated, regardless of how many different departments or silos that it goes across. Because I'm sure you've all encountered the fact that full consensus on making decisions in processes like that is usually not possible. There needs to be someone that's empowered by leadership to speak with the voice of the customer and make the final decisions about how the process will be and how the process will work. And having that person in place allowed us to move very, very quickly automating all of these different processes. And another thing that leadership did to help us move quick was to make it very clear right from the outset that the goal of this program was not to eliminate anyone's job, but purely just to allow people to do more and allow them to grow within the company. And the results here were fantastic. Again, it was a huge enterprise program where 20 plus processes were automated in less than 2 years. These were the processes that were generating a lot of compliance issues in their manual state, and after they were automated, they were completely eliminated, and they did achieve that 45% productivity improvement. They're doing very well in this market, and they did not have to grow their staff significantly to support it.
And to Neil's point, one of the key processes there was the product request process. It's the sampling process by which they provide samples to their customers to then test on new manufacturing lines, which allowed that growth into the life sciences business. That process touches probably at least a dozen departments within the company. And they picked a single person, a process owner from the sales support department, who's the primary operator of this process. And that person became the gateway for everyone else who had stake in the game to say, we will or we won't be able to include that feature or that enhancement for you during the initial development, but we might be able to get to it later. But it helped us manage the project and keep it on a tight timeline.
Yeah, that's a great example of effective process ownership for sure. So again, the lesson that we draw from this one is that leadership from as high up as possible should make sure that there's the appropriate focus and engagement within the organization, that it's a priority, and that every process that's being worked on has a clear owner who's empowered to make decisions on the process. Now, the third customer and example we'd like to share is a large healthcare company which was seeking to digitize their whole process from end to end for benefits administration. And this was a very challenging project because the starting point was many, many different silo departments, many different silo Excel spreadsheets and other information systems that weren't talking to one another. And the key to success here was to get away from that silo thinking and create a shared view of the process that everyone could agree on and to start designing around. So we stepped out of the details with this particular customer. I remember very clearly we got into a room with a whiteboard and started mapping out the high-level milestones and steps within the process. And from there, we're able to use tools like SciPoc, which we stole from Six Sigma, and Bizagi Modeler, to decompose each one of those main phases and processes in a very rigorous way so that we could identify all of the different sub-processes which we were going to automate, identify all the different dependencies, and start to look at ways that we could introduce things like reusability. Great results here as well. Using this type of approach, we're able to align 35 different business units around the company on this shared common process, eliminated most of those legacy spreadsheets and tools, and provided for the first time this single view of the process from end to end so that leadership could really understand what was going on in their business and drill down into any level of detail.
And then in a similar but different vein, that same manufacturing company from before with the 20 processes, what we did for them was we mapped out all 20 processes, what departments they're tied to, who's the primary department for each process, and we looked at how those processes would then interact with each other, and that allowed us to sequence how we were going to develop the processes and pair processes together or group them into subsets that made sense, so that things like label request got paired with the SKU change request and the spec control request and the process change request, because all of those things should in fact talk to each other. And being able to identify that they should all talk to each other allows you to then think about how their data models should be similar and related and have reusable pieces to then tie together.
Yeah, that's another great example. I think I'm a little bit familiar with this project, and I think I would have gone crazy if I didn't have that higher level map to try and understand what the different dependencies were. So again, the lesson from this particular customer is that it's important to start your design with a systems approach. Even when you're starting out your project, maybe small, and getting started with digital process automation or BPM, don't just start in one silo, not thinking about the bigger picture, but try and create that higher level map of your organization and your processes and start to decompose and find the right fit within that. Now, our fourth example is from a multinational insurance company that we're working with. And the goal of the project here was to digitize the identity access management processes within that company. So that's everything to do with onboarding new employees and contractors, auditing their access while they're on board to make sure they have access to the right things, and when the time comes, deprovisioning those people and making sure that all that access is removed. And this was a remarkable project because of the size and the agility of the team. We had 2 consultants on our team paired with 2 resources from the customer side, and we're able to deliver a huge and complex process. Any of you that have worked on these types of processes before or even participated in them will get a sense for how challenging these could be. And we were able to do it with a very small team because the people who were developing and building the process were in the room right from the start with the customer stakeholders, helping them to define the solution. We don't follow a traditional waterfall type of approach where you have a project manager and business analysts who throw information over the wall to a developer who then develops something and comes back a little bit later with something maybe hopefully it works. But the developer is an active participant in the process because they're trained to be an analyst, a modeler, even a project manager if need be. The other thing which enables all this to happen is the BPMN model, which underlies Bizagi. This is one of the great strengths of Bizagi and tools like it, is the fact that you can express your whole design and all of your business requirements in a model that business folks and technical folks can understand. And we take it to the maximum logical conclusion where we're attaching all of our requirements, all of our design specifications to the model. So it has to relate in some way to some shape or some step in the business process to be considered a requirement, which eliminates a lot of the ambiguity. Now, the other thing that we do is we heavily reuse proven and pre-built templates for common scenarios to make sure that we can cut down on design and build time. An example that we used in this process was a little utility which creates ServiceNow tickets and then checks the status of those tickets. And this particular customer has been using it all over their company after that. And that's necessitated as we're starting to establish these kind of standards and we're achieving these successes, the creation of a center of excellence to basically lay the framework for managing all of these standards and for rolling out the project throughout the rest of the organization. And there's going to be a presentation actually tomorrow afternoon where Neil Kluski is going to be presenting on this very topic. So I would highly recommend checking that out. Great results here. Again, we executed this with a small team. It was rolled out to 450 managers across the company, reduced the cycle time by 6 weeks, and cut out 800 plus spreadsheets, which we all know how much we love spreadsheets, and we're sad to see them go, but that is mostly considered a success.
Yeah, and another example of a center of excellence at the semiconductor material manufacturer is they have a workflow change board that's been in existence for several years now. It's not active where they meet every week, but they do activate it when necessary, such as when we presented the initial plan for the 20 plus processes that were being created, and you know, some of them own a few processes, but it was definitely a lot easier to deal with 15 or so people as opposed to, you know, 50 or 60 people that those processes actually touch from each department. And it made it easier to do the planning and management, coordinate the resources, establish common goals and common terminology so that, you know, it reduced the need for a lot of follow-up meetings where we were having to explain things from the get-go. So, yeah, so that was an example where it's not necessarily meeting every week, but when it's needed, they activate it as on demand.
That's great, Ray. What I like about that example is the fact that it's not this huge bureaucratic organization, because we have talked to customers about center of excellence concepts, and they're a little bit allergic to the idea because they imagine it's just another bureaucracy within the company that's going to generate a lot of paperwork and no particular results. But what's very interesting about how the customers we're working with are implementing Center of Excellence is they keep it very lean and very focused. And like Ray said, in this particular example, they just spin it up as and when it's needed. So it is possible to do a CUE in a lean manner. So our last example here is another material manufacturer, a specialty material manufacturer that was working on one very specific process. And it was the process to handle customer complaints. Anything that's wrong with the materials that they're providing or the service, it's all managed by this business process. And the response time for handling issues prior to implementing this process was one of the biggest findings that was flagged by customers. in customer satisfaction surveys and in audits, that were feeling that it was unacceptable how long it was taking to resolve all these different issues. So they needed to improve it, and they followed a very data-driven process to do that. They started off by establishing a baseline, in other words, understanding what their current state is in terms of how long it takes for the process to complete. And then they identified what their goal should be based upon that. And from there, once they had built and deployed the process within Bizagi, they could use all the great tools that come bundled with the software. I'm sure you've all seen for BAM and analytics, where they can see how they're doing against those targets, where the bottlenecks are, and extract the relevant data to make improvements. And what was really great about this customer is they didn't look at it as a one-and-done type of project where they would design everything until it's perfect, put it into production, and then forget about it. They put the first version, again, very quickly into production. They started measuring right away. They learned from it, and they put in improvements, and then they released again. And they continued doing that over time so that year over year, they were reducing the number of days open for customer complaints by 50%. And the customers were delighted by this. The customer satisfaction scores were increased significantly because of this improvement. And they've been able to continually tighten those response targets and goals year over year as well. They're considered world-class in their industry right now for that very reason. Oh, go ahead.
And some of those, just talking to Neil's point there, some of those findings that they used to actually improve that process and tighten those timelines and meet their deliverability goals were things like determining that with a process that has longer runtimes, having reminders built into the system actually save a lot of energy because people aren't necessarily working in Bizagi every day if it takes 2 weeks to complete a task. So they aren't always going to be there to see that they have a event that needs to be completed. So having a reminder for them was actually really critical in helping them reduce their runtime.
It's a great example, and it's a simple one too. I mean, it wasn't necessarily a rocket science from technology perspective, but it was something that they identified that can improve their process and brought real gains pretty much immediately, I think. So let's tie it all together then, because each of these 5 lessons is important, obviously, but stepping back to really achieve success with a digital automation program, you really need to do all 5. And some of you might be coming from an IT-based BPM background. Some of you might be coming from a Six Sigma-based background for process improvement. Some of the people going further back may even be familiar with Deming's model of Plan, Do, Check, Act. Regardless of what model you're following, the best practices and the keys to success, in our opinion, are the same. You should start off when you're originating your program and you're selecting your process and defining your indicators to make sure it's clearly aligned to an energizing vision with your business strategy and your business goals. You should make sure that you have the right engagement and ownership structure in place so that you can execute your program quickly with support from leadership. You should start designing your processes with a systems approach from the top down, using a shared common view of the top level process. You need to have the right framework in place to have close collaboration between everyone involved in the project, especially the developers, and that's underpinned by strong standards that you can develop with a COE. And you should have a continuous measurement and continuous improvement feedback loop in place where, again, you don't put your process or your project into production and just hope that everything is solved as a silver bullet, but that there's a commitment to continuously improving and making those adjustments. If you do all of that, if you have the right digital platform, and if you have the right execution capability, for example, working with folks and partners such as ourselves, in our experience, you'll be much more likely to achieve those outstanding results for cycle time, customer satisfaction, productivity, and compliance. So with that, I would like to say thank you very much. Thanks for coming along. I'll open it up for questions here if anyone has any. Go ahead.
A couple of quick questions. Thank you. Is there a cost associated with using what we might call your accelerator library, the template library?
That's a great question, actually. So you're right. Over the years, working with different customers, we have what we feel are very strong best practices, but we don't sell them a la carte necessarily on the open market, because what we found is just taking and downloading a template isn't necessarily enough to be successful with it. You really have to understand how it fits into the overall design of your process and how it's going to be integrated technically with Bizagi. That being said, when we're engaged on consulting arrangements with our customers, we share that library with them and we advise them on how to properly integrate it.
Very good, thank you. Second question. You were talking about work reminders. Do you set that up as task-based, or is there something you can do as far as making that a daily digest?
Oh, that's a great question. So let me take this, and then David, you can add some color commentary, because we've actually done both. One of the common requirements that we hear is we would like a capability where an email goes out to managers every day just giving a status report, or maybe weekly or monthly status report. Here's everything that's open, here's the status, here's where you should follow up. And that's not something that today Bizagi offers out of the box, but it's actually surprisingly easy to model. We can create a scheduled process that runs in the background that generates that status report and emails it out based upon whatever distribution list that you define in a parameterized list. I think what David was talking about was something that's more in line with the process, right, David?
Yeah, so the one I was referring to was a reminder that gets paired with each individual task. It's got a custom set of attributes that we're displaying specific to that task that are relevant to the user to prompt them with the kind of information that would remind them of what it was they were supposed to be doing with that case. Because in this case, the company was actually hopeful that if they're just working on a task, if it's like a 20-day task and they're getting a reminder at 5 days, 10 days, 15 days, and then at 20 days, that it just gives them enough information to know what it was they're being reminded about without having to go all the way into the system to say, oh, right, I'm still working on that thing.
Yep. Very good. Any other questions?
Hey, Neil. I want to go back to your first case study with the healthcare company with the traumatic brain injury patients, and then tie it to your last slide.
Sure.
When you have a CTO or CIO that has the vision that he had at that healthcare facility, to where his primary goal was to get the patient on board, but then his further goal was to have the clinicians within that clinic having Bizagi on their smartphone or their tablet and issuing patient treatment. So the process could be 17 weeks long.
Right.
Tie that to your last slide. When you don't have that individual internally, how much time does Innovelocity find themselves spending on identifying those core processes before you can grow it to what you really need?
That's a great question, because you're right, it can be a challenge. If you have very senior leadership at the C-level that's defining the priorities, that's best practice number one, is to set that vision, set the scope, and everything flows down from there. If you don't have that in place, let's say it's originating from maybe mid-level and someone's interested in experimenting, it's really a process of discovery. We can help folks to up-level when you're talking about mapping out the whole enterprise from end to end, at least define those big boxes with them to see where their process fits and then where the other candidates might be. But without the leadership in place to really guide what those priorities are, it frankly can be a little bit of a struggle.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, I have one question. Thank you. You have mentioned that you have, once you select the project that you want to work, and you have different stages to follow. But how this integrated with Agile methodology, for example, Scrum. I don't know if when you work with any particular project, you have small deliveries or not.
That's a great question, actually, yeah. So we're big believers in Scrum and in Agile. And in our opinion, it's a perfect pair for something like Bizagi, where you have to have these rapid iterations, rapid releases. So on almost every project we work on, if the customer doesn't already have that methodology in place, we help to advise them. We'll bring in something like VSTS to help them set up their backlogs, help them understand what is a user story and what is a feature and how you can decompose the design in such a way where it can be managed using Scrum. We even provide templates already kind of preset for here's a standard Bizagi project in Agile. So it really helps them to get started with the methodology if they're not already familiar with it. Very good. Well, I think we're just about out of time here. We might have time for one more question if anyone has anything else. Very good. Well, thank you all for joining us here, and we'll see you around in the conference. Please stop by our booth. It's right outside. Thank you.